the annals of Westminster history, not for decades, possibly centuries, have so many parliamentarians together faced the prospect of going to jail on such serious charges. Today, the Director of Public Prosecutions did more perhaps to undermine the British democratic establishment than he ever managed in his days as a revolutionary student Trotskyite.
In 4 cases, we have concluded that there is sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges and that it is in the public interest to charge the individuals concerned. Accordingly, summonses in these cases have been obtained from the City of Westminster Magistrates Court and will now be served on the individuals in question.
The former Labour Minister Elliot Morley faces 2 charges under the 1968 Theft Act of false accounting in expense claims relating to his mortgage. Labour MP David Chater faces 3 similar charges over rent and IT expenses. And Labour's Jim Devine the same charge twice over for cleaning and stationery expenses. While Lord Hanningfield faces 6 such charges for his overnight expenses from the Lords. He's the most senior politician of the 4, serving until today as leader of the Tories' flagship Essex Council and as a Tory frontbench spokesman in the Lords. The 3 Labour MPs later issued this statement. We totally refute any charges that we have committed an offence and we will defend our position robustly. We are confident of our position and have been advised by eminent QCs. And Jim Devine also said,
I've only just heard this. I'm devastated by the news. I knew that from where I was sitting, I had no case to answer with allegations that have been made. There are now new allegations. Clearly, I need to go and investigate them. But I think this should have been dealt with in the first instance with the House of Commons.
Gordon Brown's reaction?
I'm very angry about what's happened. We took steps some months ago to remove the right of these candidates, these people to stand as candidates for the Labour Party. These are very serious criminal allegations. All criminal allegations have got to be investigated. It's a matter now for the courts. We've got to get rid of that old politics.
The DPP also revealed today those being charged had argued they were protected from prosecution because of parliamentary privilege under the 1689 Bill of Rights.
We have considered that question and concluded that the applicability and extent of any parliamentary privilege claimed should be tested in court.
The application of parliamentary privilege to charges such as false accounting, I think, is a bit of a long stretch. It's a long stretch because parliamentary privilege is there primarily to protect freedom of speech, freedom from interference from the Crown. And this is a far cry from charges which involve allegations of dishonesty and providing false documents in order to potentially enrich themselves.
That the 3 Labour MPs should have been using the argument of parliamentary privilege to say that their cases ought to be dropped has been causing particular anxiety in Downing Street. Gordon Brown and his aides fear that the public will think that the MPs are simply saying we're above the law. But the embarrassing thing for the Labour leadership is that the 3 MPs have been employing the same firm of solicitors that the Labour Party uses for many of its big cases. Although in this instance, the 3 MPs and the firm of lawyers have not been funded by the Labour Party. The key question is how much the expenses saga will affect the election. This week, the Labour MP and one-time YouTube star Sean Simon announced he's leaving Parliament, having paid back £20,000 of his expenses. He's the latest of 133 MPs so far to have said they're quitting. Many touched by the expenses scandal, though others not. But it's easily a post-war record, beating the 128 MPs who quit in 1945. And on current trends, this year's figure could top 160.
They say Hazel, we say out.
Hazel Blair's in Salford, for instance, faces an independent anti-sleaze candidate who was picked last night. And it's Labour which stands to lose most from this scandal, says an academic expert on political campaigns.
Clearly, this is not good news for Labour because there is 3 Labour MPs involved, but also people identify politicians generally, they whack the government. They don't make that distinction between politics, Parliament and the government. So I think if there were signs, and there were signs of a narrowing of the gap, this will perhaps, I don't think it's going to have a major effect. This is not seismic, but it's not a comfortable day for Labour's prospects.
With 4 separate criminal trials due later this year, or early next, it could be a long time before Parliament and politicians as a class restore their reputation and integrity.
Michael Crick. I'm joined now by Andrew Rawnsley of The Observer and Fraser Nelson of The Spectator. Does the fact, these are obviously simply allegations, but does the fact that charges are going to be laid against 3 Labour people and 1 Tory, does it cut for one party over another?
I very much doubt it. Nobody's thinking that 3 Labour MPs have been done. The public will just think MPs, politicians on the take. And it's amazing, since the start of this scandal, really nobody's distinguished between the parties. You could argue that the Tories have got more spectacular sins in the forms of duck houses, and that the Labour ones have been more serious in the form of phantom mortgages. But the whole thing merges in the public mind to be one simply of political greed.
Do you agree with that?
I agree to an extent, although Labour people have always been worried, partly because they're the government, and partly because there are simply more Labour MPs, because they're the government, that they've taken a bigger hit as a result of this scandal. Now, they're hoping that Fraser's right, and they're all fairly evenly spattered with the ordure by now. But there is a fundamental problem for Labour in that if you're the party that proclaims the merits of the state and the merits of government, much more than the Conservatives do, when the state or some of its agents are seen as corrupt or failing, it's likely to hurt you more. In the end, scandals of this nature tend to favour the right more than the left, because if government is discredited, voters tend to say to themselves, well, we might as well have less of it. Of course, David Cameron will also be helping. Fraser's quite right to say Conservative MPs, at least some of them, were just as mired in this as Labour ones. But David Cameron will obviously be hoping it feeds into a sense of it's a time for a change, which has to help the Tories.
What do you make of this possibility of a parliamentary privilege defence, which, as reporters, we know is something we can say things in Parliament which can be reported and you can't sue us for it? That's normally what we think of as parliamentary privilege.
That's right. So the idea that parliamentary privilege means that you can do fraud and still not be prosecuted for it, I think will be laughable. And if they were, in the hugely unlikely event, to get away with it, there would be absolute uproar at the idea the guys who are making laws are using that place to hide from the law. So they say they've spoken to very eminent QCs who advise them that they can get away with this defence. I would be amazed. I mean, the Crown Prosecution Service would not go to the lengths it has if it didn't think it had a very, very good chance of getting a prosecution.
No, I agree, Gavin. They won't get away. I mean, if you look back at earlier cases, there was Horatio Bottomley, who was a famous fraudster MP. He got banged up. I mean, privilege didn't work for him. Now, I'm not expressing any view about the guilt or innocence of these 3 MPs and this peer, but I suspect they're going to have to face their day in court, and it will be for a jury to decide whether they're guilty or not. And most people, Fraser's quite right, will think that's absolutely right, because one of the most corrosive things for Parliament as a whole and the political class has been this sense for the public. There's one rule for them and there's another rule for us, and things we would got prosecuted for if we'd fiddled our benefits or our tax returns, MPs have been gaily doing and appearing to get away with it.
Where do you think this actually leaves us? I mean, there will be a general election. A lot of MPs are standing down, some of whom think that they've been tarred unfairly and are just fed up and so on. There'll be a whole load of new boys and girls will come in. Is that going to be enough?
It will be a huge change, I think. This is going to be the biggest infusion of new blood that Westminster will have had since the Great Reform Act in 1832. It's incredible how this has just accelerated this great generational change. And the new MPs who come on, I think, will take a fundamentally different outlook to expenses and the whole way of public life. I mean, how many MPs do you have in front of cameras today saying, this is outrageous, those guys should be brought to justice? And they don't say that because even now there is this kind of code that they don't criticise each other for breaking the expenses laws, which reinforces the idea that all politicians are the same. After the election, the new guys, I think, will be standing up. I mean, right now they'll be chapping on doors saying, vote for me to go to Parliament, I won't fiddle my expenses, I promise you. Huge change.
It's true we're going to have a great purge, and I'm sure these many new MPs coming in will be much more careful with their expenses. But we mustn't get carried away with the idea we'll get a new communion of saints. I suspect they will be much like previous generations of politicians, and there will be the usual mixture of the grubby and the high-minded. And we remember in 1997, those Labour people saw a Conservative government thrown out, a lot of that to do with voters hating sleaze, how quickly they forgot the lesson.